The wreck of Old 97 involved what was known as the Fast Mail. It was a Southern Railway mail and express train that operated between Washington, D.C. and New Orleans, Louisiana. The southbound element of this train was always numbered 97, and over time it would be nicknamed Old 97. Back when this service operated, mail was crucially important to, well, pretty much everywhere in the world, including the United States. Remember, the internet didn't exist, cell phones didn't exist, even regular phones were still very much in their infancy. The way most people got messages across the country to their loved ones was through mail, regular old paper mail. And the rail networks were a major part of speeding up mail service. Prior to them, letters could take weeks or even months to get across the country. But trains could not only get people across the country in less than a week, but could get mail there within a few days, depending on where they were going, of course. The reason why it was called fast mail was because they wanted to advertise the fact that they were, in fact, moving the mail fast. That was literally what the point of the line was. And Southern Railway had a contract with the United States Postal Service that was very lucrative for the rail line, but it included a penalty clause for each minute that the train was late to its final destination. So the higher-ups of the rail line started really cracking down on their locomotive engineers, urging them to travel at sometimes very unsafe speeds to make sure the mail would get to its destination on time. The date of the accident was September 27, 1903. The locomotive at the head of the train that day was Southern Railway number 1102. 1102 was a 10-wheeler, which we've talked about plenty of times before, specifically an F-14 steam locomotive that was built earlier just that same year of 1903 by Baldwin Locomotive Works in Philadelphia. The F-14s were early 10-wheelers, but they were considered very good for their time. At the controls of 1102 during the time of the accident was one 33-year-old Joseph A. Brody, though he had not taken the train during the full length of the trip. When it left Washington, D.C., it was already behind schedule, and by the time it reached Monroe, Virginia, it was 1 hour late. At Monroe is when the crew switched out, and Brody took control of the locomotive. Including him, there were a total of 17 people on board at that time. Conductor John Blair, fireman A.C. Clapp, student fireman John Hodge, flagman James Robert Moody, mail clerks J.L. Thompson, Scott Chambers, Daniel Flory, Paul Argenbright, Louis Spies, Frank Brooks, Percival Indermauer, Charles Reams, Jennings Dunlap, Napoleon Malbone, J.H. Thompson, and express manager W.R. Pinckney. A short time later, when the train pulled into Lynchburg, another man, Wentworth Armistead, also climbed aboard. He was a safe locker. Safe lockers were railroad employees that were specifically there to be entrusted with the combination to a train safe. And with him on board, the total was then brought to 18 people. When the train was still at Monroe, Brody was instructed by his supervisors to get the train to Spencer, which was 166 miles or 267 kilometers away, on time. Under the official schedule, it should take the train 4 hours and 15 minutes to get to Spencer. This would mean an average speed of 39 miles per hour, or 63 kilometers an hour. But Brody was instructed to make up a 1 hour delay, meaning he'd have to get there in, at minimum, 3 hours and 15 minutes. And that would mean traveling at an average speed of 51 miles per hour, or 82 kilometers an hour. To help him out, he was instructed to maintain full speed, traveling through Franklin Junction in Gretna. This would normally have been an intermediate stop during the run, but since there was no reason for this particular train to do so, they allowed him to pass straight through it to help make up some extra time. The route between Monroe and Spencer was traveling through rolling terrain. There were many danger points on the tracks that were caused by a combination of grades and tight curves. Signs were posted all over the line to warn and remind engineers to watch their speed. But because Brody was specifically instructed to make up his time, he was pushing the train's limits of what it would take in relation to the physics of the line in question. He rapidly descended a heavy grade that ended at the 45-foot high, or 14-meter, Stillhouse Trestle Bridge. Due to his excessive speed, and likely due to the grade as well, he was unable to sufficiently brake the train as he approached the curve that led onto the trestle. This caused the entire train to jump the tracks and plunge into the ravine below. The impact caused the train to catch fire, and the flames consumed the splintered debris of the wooden mail cars. The local fire department did arrive to help beat back the inferno, but the blaze was allegedly so intense that they had a very difficult time actually extinguishing it. And the investigation afterwards to figure out exactly what had caused the derailment was greatly hampered by the damage done by the fire, and the fact that there were very, very few witnesses to the actual accident. Of the 18 men that were on board, 11 men died, 9 of which died on impact. 7 were injured. Among the deceased were Conductor Blair, Engineer Brody, Flagman Moody, and both firemen. The firemen's bodies were recovered, but they were mangled so badly that they were completely unrecognizable. Some of the survivors of the wreck believe that they only lived because they had jumped from the train right before it had plunged into the ravine. The survivors included most of the mail clerks and the express messenger. Additionally, among the loss was a significant portion of the train's cargo. Most of the mail had been caught in the blaze. One of the surviving things that was shipped was actually a large case filled with canary birds. They managed to escape and fly to safety, which sits as a bit of a bright spot in what is otherwise a pretty sad story. In another element of good news, Engine 1102 was actually recovered and repaired, put back into service until 1935, when she was cut up for scrap. The investigation that followed, by most accounts, was largely rushed and hampered by the Southern Railway, frankly, outright lying about the incident. They placed sole blame on Engineer Brody and completely disavowed the notion that he had been ordered to run as fast as possible to maintain the schedule. They'd also claimed that he descended the grade at more than 70 miles per hour, or 110 kilometers an hour. But eyewitnesses to the wreck stated that he probably wasn't going faster than 50 miles per hour at the time, or 80 kilometers an hour. While no punishment was handed out to the railroad, it is considered by modern-day historians that they were at least partially to blame for the accident. That contract with the U.S. Post Office they had, and the penalty clause that came with it, motivated them to pressure their engineers to run as fast as possible to make sure that the fast mail was always on time, no matter what. In fact, it had already caused another accident earlier that same year. On April 13th, the train had left Washington at 8 a.m., heading to New Orleans. As the train approached Lexington, North Carolina, it had collided with a boulder on the track, which derailed the train and killed that engineer and fireman as well. It's believed that had that train been operating at safe speeds, the engineer would have at least been able to slow down to a level that may not have gotten both him and his firemen killed. But since the Southern Railway was pushing for trains to move as fast as possible to maximize their profits, they had pressured their employees to operate in unsafe conditions, and then blamed them when accidents did happen. And the only memorial that has stood for them are some historical markers, a mural painted in Danville, Virginia, and, admittedly, one of the greatest country songs ever written. So that's something, I guess. The incident occurred on Tuesday, the 18th of January in 1977, at Granville, which is a western suburb of Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. The train was a commuter train that left the station in Mount Victoria in the Blue Mountains at 6:09 a.m. heading towards Sydney. The train consisted of 8 passenger carriages hauled by a 46 class electric locomotive, number 4620. The 46 class was actually initially built by Metropolitan Vickers while partnered with Bayer Peacock and Company in England, but they were always meant for the New South Wales Railways Department. 40 of them were created between 1956 and 58, but they turned out to be quite good. The last of them weren't withdrawn until January of 1996. As the history of the class may suggest, 4620 was operating just fine that day, and there was no trouble until it approached the station at Granville. This section of the line was lowered, and went under a bridge that carried Bold Street over the tracks. The locomotive suddenly derailed without warning, and struck one of the steel and concrete pillars that held the bridge up. The engine and the first two carriages managed to pass the bridge, but the first carriage broke free from the rest of the train and was torn open when it collided with a severed mast beside the track, which killed 8 people immediately. The rest of the train stopped with just the second carriage still attached but clear of the bridge. The rear half of the third carriage and the forward half of the fourth carriage were directly under the bridge. Because of its supports being knocked out, the weight was too much for the bridge to bear, and in seconds, it collapsed. Of the total number of passengers traveling in the third and fourth carriages, half were killed instantly when the bridge fell. They never even had a chance to get away. Those that did survive were trapped in the train for hours after the accident, some of them with parts of their bodies being crushed by the bridge. It's said that a few had actually been conscious and lucid, able to talk to the rescuers, but later died of crush syndrome. If you don't know, crush syndrome is a medical condition that's characterized by major shock and kidney failure after a crushing injury to skeletal muscle. Rescuers had incredible difficulty getting into the carriages to begin with to even attempt a rescue. A bit later, the bridge settled a further 5 centimeters onto the train, which trapped 2 rescuers and crushed a portable generator. To make the situation much worse, there was a gas leak. LPG cylinders were kept year-round on board the train to be used for heating in the winter. Several people were overcome by gas from these ruptured cylinders. Due to the flammable nature of the gas, this prevented immediate use of powered rescue tools due to safety reasons. The NSW Fire Brigade managed to provide some ventilation equipment to dispel the gas, and they also sprayed a constant film of water to prevent any possibility of the gas igniting. The rescue and recovery operation lasted nearly 2 days, from 8:12 a.m. on Tuesday until 6 a.m. on Thursday. Originally, the total death toll was brought to 83, but in 2017, another victim was retroactively added to the total deaths, an unborn child, as one of the victims had been pregnant at the time. Given the severe loss of life with this disaster, an official inquiry followed immediately after the accident. The remains of the train, as well as the track and the bridge, were combed over very meticulously, trying to determine what had caused it. The locomotive was found to be in good order, but the tracks themselves were another matter. They had been fastened down poorly, and over time, the rails had spread apart, eventually exceeding the limit of the gauge that the trains operated on. This is what caused the left front wheel of 4620 to come off the rail. It also came to light that the section of track had suffered derailments in the same exact way before, both resulting in a strike on the Bold Street Bridge. One was by a locomotive in 1967, and another was a loaded coal wagon in 1975. The PTC was brought under fire, but budgetary constraints were pointed out as they had been operating at a loss of hundreds of millions of dollars a year for quite a long time. And in the months before the disaster, track inspection staff had a significantly high turnover rate, which would explain why this defect was not caught. The bridge itself was also questioned severely. When it was constructed, it was found that the base of its deck was actually 1 meter lower than the road. To solve this problem, they had simply poured concrete on top. While the bridge could support the extra weight, this addition meant that not only was the bridge more in danger of collapsing, but when it did collapse, the additional weight shredded the wooden coaches. The only good thing to come out of the investigation was that the train driver was exonerated of any wrongdoing. Given the factors at play here, there was really nothing he could have done to avert the crash. Though despite this, no one in particular was ever really held accountable. 39 years after the accident, the Granville Train Disaster Association Incorporated was formed, specifically to represent those affected by the disaster. In 2007, a plaque was placed on the bridge to mark the efforts of railway workers who assisted in rescuing the survivors on the train. And those affected also made submissions on rail safety issues, also recommending that fines for safety breaches be dedicated specifically to rail safety improvements, rather than going wherever else. Now, I want to preface this video with the fact that there's just so many Swedish words involved here. I've attempted to understand the pronunciation of all of them to the best of my ability. However, I know how I am, and I just want to let you know that I can almost guarantee I will mispronounce something at some point, but I'm going to do my best. Geta, which I'm almost positive is how you say it, is a town that's now part of the municipality of Norrköping in Sweden, and it is the site of a terrible accident that occurred on the 1st of October 1918. I feel like 1918 was just a really bad year in general for trains. I mean, America had both their worst train wrecks in 1918, and apparently Sweden did too. I mean, everyone was complaining about 2020, but 1918, oof. The accident involved a mixed train as part of Swedish State Railways. It consisted of a locomotive and 10 cars. A mail car, 2 freight cars, 5 passenger cars, a dining car, and a sleeping car. The locomotive was an SJF class, number 1200. The F classes were constructed between 1914 and 1916, and they were 462 Pacific types, and they were actually extremely good. With high speed, good tractive effort, they were impressive pieces of work. And on that day, number 1200 was operating in accordance with protocol. There was nothing wrong with the train, actually. Not in any way. Not with the cars, not with the locomotive. A station guard who was on duty at Geta heard telephone wires vibrating between 6:33 and 6:40, which is not normal under any circumstances, and it was only some time later when people realized what had actually happened. There was an embankment down the line from Geta, and in order to build the track, they had carved into it. This embankment had a layer of clay, and due to heavy rains, the bearing capacity of it had diminished. A landslide was beginning, and the whole thing had come down sometime between 6:52 and 6:55, taking with it the telegraph network that ran along the railway line. Number 1200's train, which was train 422, was actually running late, and she had pulled out of Norrköping station 12 minutes behind schedule. The practice in Sweden was that the next station down the line would always be contacted by telegraph using a simple signal, tag ut, once a train had left the previous station. That way they knew the train was on the way. Train 422 had not pulled out till 6:54. This was after the telegraph lines had already come down, and the next station, in Krokek, had tried to contact the other station to see why they had not received the tag ut, as they knew a train was due and should be on the way by now, but they couldn't reach the station. At 6:57, Abbey Station in Norrköping tried to reach Krokek Station, and they realized that they couldn't get a response either. Something was wrong, but nobody could contact the train. As it traveled down the line, it was believed to have been going at least 65 kilometers an hour, or 40 miles per hour. Engineer Wallström looked on in horror as the landslide came into view. Locomotive number 1200 was the first to go off the rails. She slid down the embankment and came to rest on her right side on the road below it. The cars between the locomotive and the dining car were completely destroyed by the accident, and the dining car partially slid down the embankment as well. The last 2 cars on the train actually stayed on the rails. Engineer Wallström had actually hit his head in the accident, and he had a really bad concussion, but he managed to drag himself out of the locomotive to safety. The train's conductor, Mr. Strum, was in the last passenger car at the time of the accident, so he was still on the tracks. He climbed off the car and headed towards the locomotive to check on Wallström. Wallström was still conscious and informed him that his stoker, Carlson, was actually buried underneath the coal. With no way to contact anybody from where they were at, Strom headed back towards Abbey Station to inform them about the accident, and on the way he met one Mr. Anderson, who was a track walker. Mr. Anderson went to a nearby house and called Abbey to tell them what had happened. Another track walker, Eriksson, arrived from his house east of the accident site. Once he realized the scale of the accident, he went off to get a halt to notify Krokek Station about what had happened. As this was all going on, embers from the locomotive's boiler had started to ignite the dry wood in the badly damaged passenger cars. Many of the people that had survived got out of these cars before this occurred, but some were trapped, and as the fire spread, they were consumed alive by it. Out of 170 people that were on board the train, 42 died, and 5 people were reported missing. There were also 41 people that sustained injuries, and the accident was bad enough that the line would be closed down for over 2 months until the 21st of December, 1918. The investigation that followed, that was launched by the Royal Railroad Board, focused on a few factors relating to the crash. The first part of the inquiry tried to determine what had caused the coaches to catch on fire, as they considered this a major hazard if it was something that could be prevented. They thought it might be the acetylene gas that had been used in the lighting, but further examination showed that it was actually the burning coal from the engine. It actually had nothing to do with the gas. The rest of the inquiry actually looked at the cause of the accident from a geological perspective, as early on it was pretty clear that what had happened was kind of an act of God. It wasn't necessarily any one person's fault, certainly not the employees on board the train, who had no idea there had been a landslide, or anybody at the stations for that matter. There had been no time to check out the tracks, it had happened so quickly. But the Geotechnical Commission of the Swedish State Railways wanted to know why there had been a landslide. As it turned out, there was actually a prehistoric landslide in this same spot, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years prior to the accident. This prehistoric landslide had actually increased the flow of water in that spot, causing the hill to erode a lot more quickly than the engineers responsible for laying the tracks would have believed at the time. These exceptional circumstances were suggested as the reason why it was believed that the bearing capacity of the soil was greater than it really was. In fact, in 1923, another landslide occurred in that same spot. This time, it caused the road running along Bravik Bay to collapse. This particular stretch of track was actually very new. It had only been open for 5 years, so there really hadn't been any previous signs that anything was amiss until this catastrophic thing occurred. As a result, it was ruled that the accident was simply something that was overlooked due to ignorance, not apathy, and no one was held directly responsible for the accident, though changes were made to the design of the hill to try to prevent this from happening ever again. The track was shifted 1 meter towards the side of the mountain, and they reinforced the embankment with rocks. That particular stretch of line also had a speed limit reduction to just 15 kilometers an hour. The line's still there in modern times, although nowadays the speed has been set at a flat 100 kilometers an hour. Though based on what I know, there haven't been any accidents as a result of this since this 1918 disaster. Today, there are 2 monuments that stand as a testimony to what happened on that day. The first is at the site of the accident, along the old road between Abbey and Sandviken, and the second is located at Norra Kyrkogården, the cemetery in Norrköping. Many of the victims of the crash couldn't be identified, and they were buried in a mass grave. Though, in a surprising twist, the locomotive herself, F1200, was rebuilt after the accident, and is still around today. She remained in service with the Swedish State Railways until 1937, when she was sold to the Danish State Railways, who would continue to use her for many years to come. In fact, during World War II, on the 21st of April 1943, she was hit by an air raid, but fixed again, and in 1963, she was returned to Sweden and put on display at the Swedish Railway Museum, where she's considered to be in running condition. 1918 was not generally considered a great year for humanity in general, to be honest. World War I was still raging, and the Spanish flu epidemic was causing catastrophe all over the world beyond just the war. But our story focuses on Tennessee in the United States, and involves 2 passenger trains that were under the operation of the Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway, or NC and STL. That railroad was an integral part of the United States rail network for many years, and they went through multiple ownership changes over the last century, and their lines are now a part of the CSX network. One of the trains, train number 4, was scheduled to depart Nashville, Tennessee for Memphis at 7 a.m. that morning. The train consisted of 2 mail and baggage cars, as well as 6 wooden passenger coaches. They were pulled by locomotive number 282, which was a G8A class 460 10-wheeler. We've discussed 10-wheelers on this channel before, but the G8As are actually probably one of the best examples, as they were considered a technological marvel for their time. They were fast, efficient, with a decent tractive effort, all this despite not being the largest locomotives ever built, and they would go on to serve till after World War II. The other train was train number 1. It was pulled by locomotive number 281, the sister of 282, and yes, they were both G8As built by Baldwin in the same year, 1905. Number 1 was on its way into Nashville from Memphis. It had 1 baggage car, 6 wooden coaches, and 2 Pullman sleeping cars of steel construction. Both engines were known to be operating within parameters on that day, but train number 1 was 35 minutes behind schedule. Number 4 was engineered by David Kennedy, and number 1 was engineered by William Floyd, and in a twist right out of every cliche imaginable, this run was supposed to be Floyd's last before his retirement. Number 4, departing Union Station in Nashville, was westbound and would eventually have to use a single track section of the line that was about 10 miles long. Standard procedure for this sort of situation, when there were 2 trains needing a single line, was that any inbound train, in this case number 1, would have retained the right of way. Therefore, number 4 would have to wait for number 1 to pass them before proceeding onto the single section of track. The railroad dispatchers informed the crew of number 4 that they were to stop in the double track section if they did not visually identify the passing of number 1 before they reached the interlocking tower, which was known as Shops Junction. It was at this junction where the single track section started. But as I said, number 1 was behind schedule, and was still on the single track section of the lines. While number 4 headed down the double track section, the conductor on board delegated the responsibility of identifying number 1 to the remainder of the crew. This is not standard procedure. That specific responsibility is his and his alone. But he wanted to focus on collecting tickets, and while he was doing this, he mistook the sound of a passing switch engine that had empty passenger cars as the number 1 train. The crew members he left in charge of identifying the number 1 train either made this same error or simply didn't bother to identify whether the train had passed or not. This act of negligence alone wouldn't have been enough to cause the accident, but further errors abounded. As number 4 approached Shops Junction, Engineer Kennedy observed the fact that the signal tower showed an all-clear signal. The tower's operator, J.S. Johnson, had mistakenly left the signal in this position, but when he stopped to record number 4's passing in his logs, he noticed in horror that number 1 had not passed. He immediately reported this to the dispatch office and received a telegraph message back saying, "He meets number 1 there. Can you stop him?" Johnson immediately sounded the emergency whistle, which was the only way he had of letting number 4 know to stop at that point. But at that time, there was no one at the rear of number 4's train to actually hear it. Engineer Kennedy had simply trusted the signal and assumed the track was all clear, and proceeded accordingly. Now, on the surface, it sounds like he didn't make a mistake there, the signalman did, but in accordance with policy, an engine man and conductor were supposed to stop and visually inspect the train register at Shops Junction to make sure that all opposing trains that were scheduled had already arrived before they proceeded at all. The train didn't even stop to begin this process, and it would have only been a few more minutes before Kennedy realized his error. Kennedy, in the number 4 train, would have looked on in terror as the number 1 train, engineered by Floyd, came into view. Both trains were traveling well in excess of 50 miles an hour, and though both engineers did slam on their emergency brakes to avert a catastrophe, there was simply no time to do anything about it. It was estimated after the crash that train number 4 must have been traveling about 50 miles per hour at the time of impact, while the eastbound train, number 1, was traveling about 60, meaning the trains impacted with a combined speed of 110 miles per hour. The wooden coaches that made up most of both of the trains crumbled under the strain of the impact. They were crushed or hurled sideways, and apparently the sound of the collision could be heard from 2 miles or 3 kilometers away. The accident made national news, and allegedly as many as 50,000 people came to the track the day of the accident to help in the rescue efforts, search for loved ones, or simply to look on. Most of the victims were actually African American laborers coming from Arkansas and Memphis to work at a gunpowder plant in Old Hickory, just outside of Nashville. The official death toll, given by the Interstate Commerce Commission, was set at 101, but other reports listed the death toll as high as 121, and among those were engineer David Kennedy and engineer William Floyd. At least 171 people were also injured. The Interstate Commerce Commission obviously launched an investigation as to what happened, and they were brutal on the NC and STL Railroad. They felt that a combination of poor operating practices, human error, and a lax enforcement of their rules led to the accident. Any number of changes to the situations that led to the crash would have averted it entirely. Had J.S. Johnson properly put his signal at danger, had the conductor on board the train actually done his job and monitored the train's progress rather than trusting the rest of the crew, or had the crew on board number 4 stopped and actually checked the register as they were supposed to, 101 people would still be alive. The wooden coaches were called under question too, and it's believed that this crash was part of the reason why many railroads in the United States began using steel passenger cars, which would not have ripped apart quite as easily and perhaps saved some of the lives lost on that day. But incredibly, in some ways, despite being known as the Great Train Wreck of 1918, it kind of fell on the back burner when it came to some of the news media at the time. They did report on it, that's true, but there was a lot going on in the world at that point. Between World War I and the Spanish flu, reports of mass death and casualty across the world had become almost routine, and the mass media industry was looking to sensationalize it to make more money. Weirdly enough, some journalists seemed to think the accident just wasn't sensational enough, and preferred to focus on other things. This caused many to criticize the national news media of the United States at that time, regarding where their priorities were. Were they there simply to report the truth, or were they writing a story for their own benefit? It was a bad look, and to be honest, it's an issue with news media that people still have even to this day. As for the locomotives, 281 and 282, well, the sisters were actually rebuilt in 1919 and continued service for many decades. They survived past World War II and were both retired by 1948. Sadly, they would both be scrapped after their retirement. None of their other siblings survived either. The track itself is actually still there to this day, again under CSX's jurisdiction. Looking at it now, you'd never know this was the site of one of the worst train accidents in United States history, but over 100 years ago, it was. The Malbone Street wreck is distinctive, as it actually doesn't involve a typical train setup, as these were subway cars, under control of the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company, or BRT. It was a Friday, November 1st, 1918, at approximately 6:42 p.m. It was the end of the week rush hour, and the train was carrying about 650 passengers. It had just exited from the elevated part of the New York City subway line, and was now in a tunnel beneath Malbone Street, headed towards Prospect Park Station, where the train had to negotiate a rather tricky reverse curve. This is a curve that goes one direction, and then turns back all the way, and goes the other one. It's sometimes called an S-curve, and this section of the track had a set speed limit of only 6 miles per hour, or 10 kilometers per hour. But when the train entered the tunnel, it's believed that it was going at least 30 miles per hour, or 50 kilometers per hour. Much too fast for this curve. As the train moved along, the back wheels of the first car derailed, and the two cars after it left the tracks completely. They struck the tunnel walls, and their left sides and most of their roofs were torn off. Out of the 5-car train, the first and fourth cars were relatively unscathed, and the fifth was completely intact. The second and third, however, were almost completely destroyed. According to the New York Times, passengers were trapped in what could be described as a darkened jungle of steel dust and wood splinters, glass shards, and iron beams, projecting like bayonets. Due to the location of the accident, it took 45 minutes for rescuers to descend to the site, and since this was in 1918, at the height of the Spanish flu epidemic, the nearest hospital was at capacity, so a makeshift infirmary was created at the nearby Ebbets Field to help those suffering from severe injuries. Out of the 650 passengers on board, possibly 102 were killed in the accident, and 250 people suffered from injuries. So what happened? Why would the train go into the tunnel that quickly? Did the motorman not know that there was a speed limit in that area? Well, to be honest, probably not. There were actually a lot of different causes for this crash, and one of them was the motorman's lack of experience. 25-year-old Antonio Edward Luciano was not actually officially a motorman. He'd been hired as a crew dispatcher. But on the morning of November 1st, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers that represented some of the motormen working for the BRT went on strike over issues involving union organization and the discharge from employment of 29 of its members. This caused a sudden shortage of motormen, so BRT had to find others to fill the roles. Luciano had been pressed into the role by the company because he had at least some experience moving trains, but he'd never driven a passenger train before, and he wasn't even familiar with the Brighton Beach line where the accident happened. His only experience with trains was parking non-revenue trains in a train yard a year before the accident. Prior to him taking this train out, he had received less than 3 hours of classroom instruction in being a motorman, and was not officially certified as one either. Which is just nuts to me. I mean, we get more training to get a driver's license in America. This dude was put in charge of a 650-person train? After a 3-hour course, for reference, at that time, the norm was no fewer than 90 hours of instruction and hands-on training with the subway cars. Luciano's instruction wasn't even close to minimal. And to make it even worse, he was likely emotionally compromised at the time, as just 3 days before the accident, his daughter had tragically died to the Spanish flu. He himself was also recovering from it. The emotional weight of such a thing could have easily impaired a more experienced motorman, let alone someone who was not given proper instruction like Luciano. The train had been improperly coupled together. It had consisted of 3 powered motor cars and 2 unpowered trailer cars. The motor cars were twice as heavy as trailer cars, and the trailers were also more top-heavy than motor cars, especially when they had passengers on board. The standard procedure was to avoid coupling 2 trailer cars together at all by having a single trailer between 2 motor cars, always. This setup would provide needed stability on lighter trains, but on that train, the 2 trailer cars had been coupled together, and it was those 2 cars, numbers 80 and 100, that were in the second and third positions, and sustained the bulk of the damage. And as we already established, a big part of the reason the train derailed was the overwhelming speed. It was doing at least 30 miles per hour when it derailed. Luciano said that he attempted to slow the train, but an investigation of the wreck found that this probably wasn't the case. The emergency brake had not been engaged, and the train's motors hadn't been reversed. Witnesses also stated that the train had not slowed at all approaching or in the S-curve. Prior to the wreck, while Luciano was driving on the route, he had actually overshot multiple stations and had difficulty timing the train's progress and braking accordingly. Though, to be blunt, this was likely more owed to his lack of training as a result of BRT's decision to press him into operating the train when he was neither trained nor licensed. The mayor of New York at the time, John F. Hyland, blamed the BRT, and Luciano and company officials were put on trial for manslaughter. Luciano actually testified on his own behalf, and he insisted that he was in control of the train, but that the train did not respond properly. This opposed BRT's own narrative and investigation of the equipment, which showed that the brakes were in good working order and not placed in the emergency application. The trial dragged on until 1921, and all the defendants were actually acquitted, and the charges dropped. BRT, however, did have to pay a significant amount in damages. By 1921, they had paid out a combined $75 million in crash-related liens, and was out of funding to pay anything further. They went into receivership, which ended in 1923, and they were succeeded by BMT, or the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation. BMT was responsible for paying BRT's outstanding claims, and they dispersed a further $1.6 million. The overall operation and standards of the New York City subway system was actually improved after this accident. The old wooden cars that had been involved in the wreck would be slowly phased out over time, and additional safety devices were added to the subway, including speedometers, which, believe it or not, were not actually in the old cars, headlights, deadman switches, and automatic trackside devices called trippers or train stops that reduce the likelihood of trains operating too fast for conditions. They also added additional signals to warn motormen if they had to slow down or not. And as for Luciano, the man who had no business being a motorman on that day, well, he was acquitted and adopted the name Anthony Lewis to hide his identity. He became a house builder in Queens Village, Queens, and he would later retire to Tucson, Arizona, where he lived till 1985 and died at the age of 91. Truth be told, I can't work up that much anger towards Luciano. He had been forced into this situation by the company. He had been given basically no training. Between losing his daughter and possibly the worry of losing his job on top of that, it's really hard to get mad at him directly. True, he'd made a mistake, but only out of ignorance, not out of apathy. But since he lived a long time, hopefully he found some peace after a while. On November 1st, 2019, officials finally installed a permanent bronze memorial plaque at the northern exit of Prospect Park Station. It serves as a solemn reminder of the worst accident in the New York City subway system's history, and what may be the worst accident in American history.